Hey, everybody. This is Nevin, your host of the Populist Patriot. And with me looks like our first guest for the new year. Happy New Year 2023 is Jared Nyquist. Earlier this week, I did a live stream, just some news and updates, and we're going to be having trying to work out some guest appearances of economist, historian, national security expert William R. Hawkins Jr., and the YouTuber Econoboy, who's kind of a center left by today's terminology, economics expert, and hopefully other guests from both sides of the political aisle to talk about various issues. And with me today is Jared Nyquist, who is our recurring guest and expert on national security issues, especially the threats led by Russia and China to the United States. Welcome back to the program, and Happy New Year, Jeff.
Happy New Year, Nevin. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for coming on, as always, to our program. For those of you who don't know, Jared Nyquist has a blog, Jared Nyquist blog, that could be found on the Internet World Wide Web. He is a prolific author of several books, including The Origins of the Fourth World War, which kind of, well, perhaps without Jeff's intentions, kind of changed my views from helped change my views from a sort of economic libertarian or a Reagan conservative. It was one of many factors that changed me. It also opened my eyes to the Cold War did not end. So Mr. Nyquist, Jeff has kind of changed and altered my views on important topics, historical topics. So, Jeff, you wrote a program where you included an individual and his, quote, predictions, Igor Panarin. Before you discuss the article, who is Igor Panarin?
He's a KGB colonel who's worked as an advisor to Russian and Soviet leaders, probably to Gorbachev, but most certainly, famously, to Yeltsin, and almost certainly to Putin. He has been a teacher at their high diplomatic school and a teacher of KGB officials. And what is most surprising is that he began a project in 1990 under the Soviet Union to study the question of whether the United States was susceptible to civil war and what a civil war would mean in grand strategic terms for Moscow, and probably how Moscow and its ally, the Chinese, would exploit a civil war in the United States. And the evidence for that is in the unusual map with which Igor Panarin discussed on RT, the Russian TV channel, in 2008, which was showing America divided between Russia, China, Canada, Mexico, and Japan, believe it or not.
So how realistic do you think that map is? Because you touched upon that in your article, but tell the audience, do you think that's really realistic portrayal of who would take over in the successor states once the collapse of the United States was completed, or do you have a different opinion on that? What are your thoughts?
Well, it's only realistic in a Machiavellian sense, in the sense that they would like to dangle the prospect of, hey, here, see Japan, see Mexico, see Canada, what we're willing to give you if you join with us. But realistically, if the United States didn't exist, Russia and China wouldn't have to give Canada or Mexico or Japan the time of day, let alone a chunk of the United States. And the defector, Colonel Stanislav Lunev, the GRU defector, the highest ranking military defector from the Russian Federation that we've ever had, basically told me and a few other people, a couple other people that I know, that that at the last meeting of the Russian generals in Moscow that he was at, and I believe this was early 92 because he defected in March of 92, he was told that after the fall of the Soviet Union, the war plan against the United States was still on, the nuclear world war plan. Russia would provide the missile power, and China would provide the manpower. And they would divide the continent. They would defeat the United States and divide North America up, with Russia getting Alaska and parts of Canada, and China getting the lower 48 states. And the only other countries that would be allowed in would be for looting rights. They wouldn't be giving territory away to anyone else. And of course, in 2008, I guess when Panarin made his map presentation, they didn't want to make it so barefaced as China's getting the lower 48, Russia's just getting parts of Alaska and Canada. It was better to kind of divvy up, make it appear like Russia and China weren't the main culprits dividing up the United States.
Yeah, I mean, and a couple of questions and a couple of points here, for the audience. I mean, guys, I thought the Cold War ended and that when Gorbachev resigned in December 25th, 1991, oops, I guess the Cold War never ended, did it, Jeff?
No. That's the thing, is that when you're retaining plans and you're continuing to having people who are paid and who are colonels in the KGB or the FSB, whatever the organization is that they put him under, could be he's SVR, but whatever he is doing, he's being paid. And what we find, what he inadvertently admitted in his 2008 interview, was that he started this study in 1990, not in 1998, which is like what you find on the wiki about it, and that it was continuing to 2008. And since Panarin is my age, he's 64 years old, he would be still at it now in 2023.
And right? I'm sure many other people are on personnel and involved with the intelligence community and international relations are involved in multiple studies, perhaps, for the Putin dictatorship, for the top brass of the SVR in particular.
Right.
Right.
Now, and it's particularly, I should note, it's particularly disturbing when you see that Russia's invading Ukraine. It's now engaged in an attempt to conquer large chunks of territory, to reassemble the Soviet Union. And while it's doing it, it's threatening other countries. There's leaked out talk of going beyond, and of course, constant threats of war with Britain, nuking Britain, attacking the United States, attacking NATO, and then also talks by certain figures about Europe from Lisbon to Vladivostok, being all of Europe being just a Russian territory. So
it was the majority leader or the equivalent of the majority leader of the Russian Duma, affiliated with the United Russia Party, that talked about a Europe that is basically under Russian influence from Lisbon to Vladivostok.
Right.
So Ukraine is just really a first stepping stone as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah. So rather than going back to the thing about the giving Japan and Canada and Mexico territory, rather than seeing that happen, the implication of America's neutralization or destruction or being divided up is that not only does Russia and China get the spoils in North America, but Russia's going to get Europe out of that.
Correct.
And that's what the Duma guy is saying. So there's territorial aggrandizement, and of course, just to reiterate, they had last year sightings on Russian roads in Siberia of giant billboards saying, Alaska is ours.
Mm-hmm. Well, there was an article, I don't remember the publication, where it talked about there are GRU supported ethnic Russian camps in the United States even, and they have also similar signs too as well. They have this kind of revanchist view towards retaking Alaska. And just for I'm sure you know this, Jeff, but just for the audience sake, I mean, Alaska in old Soviet war planning played an important role from what we know. Jan Buchar, who was a Czechoslovakian military officer who defected in the late 1940s, he attended Soviet military academies after World War II. And they talked about also the Soviets, the military lecturers talked about the Soviets retaking Alaska back into the United States. There was a Los Angeles Times from the late 1980s. It quoted a Soviet military defector as stating that Stalin had a plan to utilize 50,000 Soviet troops to retake Alaska. That was also slightly confirmed by the well-known mainstream Cold War historian John Lewis Gaddis as well. And then of course, Soviet war planning against the United States is not heavily well known, but Jan Šejna, who was a top-level Warsaw Pact military planner, he was of Czechoslovakian nationality, defected to the United States in 1968. He talked about how he gave in a book co-authored by Stephen Simbola and Joe Douglas. Joe Douglas recounts Šejna's recollections about what the United States would look like after a Soviet invasion and occupation. And I'm not going to go into that because it was almost 2 pages long. I've covered it in other podcasts on this channel.
Of course, it was at a time when China was not strong enough to participate in a war on that scale. But needless to say, Alaska is the back door into North America because the shortest distance between the Soviet Union and the United States is the Bering Strait, which is a small amount of water to cross to go from Russia to the United States. I mean, we forget that we almost border Russia.
Mm-hmm.
You know, people forget that the United States almost has a border with Russia. We think of Russia as a European country. We don't often think, oh, wait a minute, there's 11 time zones and it comes all the way up to us near the international date line there, which runs right in between Alaska and Siberia. So, yeah.
Very true. And we can't forget also, and you touched very earlier before we went on live, also the importance of Latin America, Brazil, etc., because a Polish diplomatic defector by the name of Ladislav Rurars, who defected to the United States, I think by about 1981, he revealed in a conversation with an unnamed Soviet official, and this was reported in a bulletin, a report of accuracy in media, and it's mentioned briefly that Rurars alleged that the Soviets, in a conflict with the United States, presumably, were to bribe Mexico. Mexico supported the Soviets. They would get part of the American Southwest, which of course was conquered Mexican territory originally, and they would get that in return. And the Soviets drew upon the strategy of the so-called Zimmerman telegraph of World War I. Yeah. So the Soviets clearly, Panarin's map is when you look at it in the larger context of Soviet and then Russian Federation strategy, it's really not unusual and not as far-fetched or inconsistent with overall Soviet/Russian strategic planning.
No, it isn't, and it's. I think it's. You have to be able to judge the parts that they're lying about, because they lie about, even when they're describing their attack on you, they're lying about how they're going to do it. But yeah, Lunev spoke about the Zimmerman telegraph and the importance, saying that it was ahead of its time. Zimmerman had the right idea, but only Russia and China had the wherewithal to make it real. And of course, Mexico's under a guy that, some of my friends, especially my friends that have background from Latin America, say is a communist.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, when Castillo, the president of Peru, was fleeing, about to be overthrown, removed from power by the Peruvian legislature, he was headed to the Mexican embassy. Castillo is definitely a communist, So why is he fleeing to Mexico? There's the question. So yeah, it's important. And I should mention before I forget the news item that just popped up that really kind of took me by surprise, that China is leaning on Argentina to build a naval base, to build a military base in Argentina.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well,
which is quite significant.
I mean, you look at the situation here. I mean, Latin America, you have, I have, as a more of a kind of centrist, or if you want to term, probably by your standards, center-left, economically populist and civic nationalist, I have my disagreements with Bolsonaro policy-wise and other things. I think in his campaign there were very long overdue. His concerns about Venezuela, Cuba, China, Russia, etc. But with Lula at the helm, regardless of his domestic policies, he's clearly anti-American. During his presidency, he talked about basically overthrowing the empire, meaning the United States, in classic anti-imperialist fashion. I don't have the quote in front of me, but it was reported on KeyWiki, which is Trevor Loudon's website, as well as the more anti-communist elements of the Brazilian press. And then, of course, also, he really gives up his true sympathies, Lula da Silva and the quote-unquote Workers' Party, when they blamed Ukraine and the United States and NATO for the conflict with Russia. I mean, they actually outrightly support the Russians.
Yes, and in fact, Putin supports Lula. He supports Lula. And one other thing I should mention that's important. How can we understand? How can we wrap our head around Secretary of State Blinken going down to Brazil, threatening the Brazilian military not to intervene in the election, which was obviously fraudulent, that all my Brazilian friends say is obviously fraudulent. This isn't like the election in the United States that there's some problems that we look at the polling numbers and we think, could that really have happened? But in Brazil, it was just out and out vote stealing, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so if Biden is against Putin, the Biden administration is against Putin. If the Biden administration is against communism spreading, if it's on the side of Ukraine, why would they be doing everything that they can to assure that Lula comes to power, that there's no interference, when Lula is the friend of Putin and our enemy China and Cuba and is against Ukraine? There is a disconnect here, and I don't think the explanation is that Biden is a sincere defender of Ukraine. I think he's a sincere defender of Lula da Silva. That's what I think.
Yeah, I mean, the Biden administration, like many other, every presidential administration in my lifetime, they've never been hallmarks of consistent policy. I mean, you take a look at not only that, but also, yes, they are cracking down through sanctions to a large degree, more so with Russia than China. And there are many different things that are outside of Biden's control and even Congress's control that prevent a total shutdown really reshoring our supply chain in its entirety. And that's a whole different show unto itself. But you look at how Biden has been negotiating with the Venezuelans to import American oil. And of course, you and I may disagree on why we have the oil prices rising and whatnot, but I think you and I would definitely agree that if you're trying to contain the power of Russia and China, and presumably its allies, you're not going to be importing oil from Venezuela because you have two problems. Number one, you're giving cash to the Venezuelan government. Two, you're also giving them legitimacy. And three, you're emboldening corporations in the United States that would profit from trade with Venezuela with oil. And they would try, and Venezuela would basically, the corporate lobby on behalf of Venezuela would be revived. It existed previously when we purchased oil from Chavez and Maduro. And you have a problem. You have a national security and political influence problem, as well as you're giving cash infusions to Venezuela to keep the government afloat, to purchase more Russian and Chinese manufactured weapons, of which Venezuela has a ton of.
In terms of U.S. policy being just a little inconsistent when it comes to Brazil and Ukraine, I think that that an explanation can't be that it's an oops, we goofed, or it's just explicable by inconsistency. Because if there's one thing political actors are in their careers, is that there is a consistency. There is a pattern in a career. Maybe the pattern is that they always take the money. Maybe the pattern is that they always serve the left or the right. But in the case of Mr. Biden and his administration, the pattern is that he almost invariably harms America's security position, and that he almost invariably does not go against Russia or China in any way that's significant, that he has slow-walked his aid to Ukraine, and that he is helpful, and in fact not worried in the least that Russia-friendly regimes have come to power. Did you know that Bolsonaro in 2019 offered the United States military bases in
Yes,
Brazil?
yes, yes. I
So,
mentioned briefly in my last book. I made brief mention of that as one of his positive
yeah,
campaign
right.
uh,
So
statements.
here is the biggest friend in Latin America the United States could have, Mr. Bolsonaro. And our Democratic Party leaders are not willing to stand up for them. Now, forgive me, but when I was in college 40 years ago now, I heard a speech by a communist saying we are taking over the Democratic Party through its left wing and we're going to elect a stealth socialist communist president and we're going to take over the country. I heard that
Yeah,
40 years ago. And now I look out at what I'm seeing and I'm going, well, persistence persists, and it looks like they've done it. That's what it looks like to me. And I challenge anybody, if I'm crazy, you tell me why. Why am I
Jeff,
crazy?
Jeff, you're crazy.
Okay. Why?
Because you're crazy. No, I'm messing around with you. No,
Yeah.
look, I mean, my politics is a mixed bag, as the audience knows, you knows, and whatnot. There's no secret about that. But unfortunately, you and I and other scholars and activists, primarily conservatives, anti-communists, have documented this, and I have documented it, and I still find documentation about this. But unfortunately, the left wing of the Democratic Party has always been infiltrated. And you have Biden, who was termed Senator Credit Card, or the senator from MBNA, because of his campaign donors. He's based in Delaware, which is a notorious haven for massive corporations and whatnot. The fact of the matter is Biden on foreign policy and national security has been terrible for the United States. He has voted, for damaging deregulatory and free trade policies, including free trade policies that benefited Russia and China. He was a big supporter of permanent normal trade relations with the People's Republic of China, as well as the Russian Federation. And Biden, I'm glad that I believe you posted in the responses to your most recent essay, this document that was leaked out and smuggled out by the late Vladimir Bukovsky, which shows, and I've mentioned this 1,000 times on the
Yes.
shows, including interviews with you, because it is important.
Yes.
Basically, Biden not giving a flying fig Newton about the dissidents and openly saying it with another
Openly saying
senator.
it. I don't care about dissidents. I have to pretend to do that to look like I'm for human rights.
Exactly.
Yeah,
So
that's what he says to them.
you're not dealing, whatever his motivations, the point is he is not a good faith senator when it comes to national security. And you look at his policies, I mean, I'm a little shocked, to be honest, that he took as tough of a stand on Russia, but I think he had no choice, to be honest, because it would show his hand too much. But his record, he was probably the worst out of almost all of the Democratic
Well,
nominees.
him and John Kerry and Ted Kennedy and maybe Senator Lugar would be the best friends of Russia in the United States Senate. Am I missing somebody?
Well, there were a whole bunch in
Senator
Congress.
McCain, right?
You know,
But it's very
Ron,
funny how some of these people then became anti-Russian later in their careers after 2012, after being
mhm,
such great friends of the Kremlin.
right,
But this is the game. This is how this game is played,
right.
and this is what concerns me when we're talking about this. And getting back to civil war idea, it isn't just the left. To make a civil war, you don't just infiltrate the left in the United States, you infiltrate the right. And so therefore I'm very concerned. There's this book by Benjamin Teitelbaum, The War for Eternity, in which he recounts a secret meeting between um, Alexander Dugin
Mhm.
and Steve Bannon.
Mhm.
Have you heard of this?
I have heard about it, but I don't mean to be rude. I just wanted to buttress your earlier point. No, I'm not saying the Democratic Party is the Communist Party, but there is real Soviet, Chinese, Cuban,
Oh yeah,
Venezuelan influence within the Democratic Party. And
unfortunately, yeah.
Gus Hall, the former chairman of the American Communist Party, wrote a book called The Lame Duck in Turbulent Waters. I've seen it quoted in various anti-communist sources. I actually interlibrary loaned the book, read through it. It is true. Gus Hall wrote that the liberal wing of the Democratic Party is one of the operating legs of the Communist Party's stool. So there you go.
Yeah.
There you have it. There are many, the Communist Party, USA Press, Trevor Loudon, myself, others have documented where the communists try to influence progressives, even ones where the Communist Party clearly agree with progressives, because just because you're a progressive doesn't mean you're an ideological communist, but you could be manipulated and penetrated in ways that you can be pushed to achieve their short-term goals.
Yeah.
Now, there are Congress people that I am convinced are hard left socialists, if not secret communists. The late Ronald Dellums from California
Oh
is a,
yeah, obviously. Yeah. But
so.
the thing is what we want to see is that I think a lot of conservatives as well as progressives and liberals are influenced because Americans are ideological simpletons. They actually take on ideologies. They adopt systems of thought. And of course, I'm of the school that systems of thought are never true. You know, there may be some truths in there, but they're not true. They're basically falsifications, essential falsifications of reality that lead people astray when they become, you know, fixated on these dogmas. And so what we have is that our enemies have studied these dogmas and they've studied ways of tweaking them, tweaking the libertarians, tweaking the conservatives, tweaking the liberals and the progressives to get them to move along certain axes, to bring them into collision, to exploit them, you know, from Moscow, from Beijing. And I think this has been going on. I think it's a scissors strategy, two blades of the scissors, right? The left and the right, and the
Correct.
Russians are have the handles of the scissors and they're squeezing them and they're cutting things.
Mm-hmm.
They're cutting up American politics. They're remaking American politics. And I think this analogy, the scissors strategy, this is the one they use. It's a divide and conquer, unite and rule game. It's a the synthesis at the end is convergence and conquest. And but people here, whenever I talk to anybody, Republican or Democrat at any higher level, they give me a blank look. You know,
Mm-hmm.
there's a blank look.
Now,
So
where
I
does that?
don't know how much these people have, how what if I think they have no feel for what's happening, and so we are at risk for civil war.
Yeah. So, and what do you see the Civil War before we wrap up? Because I know you're pressed for time.
Yeah.
What do you see the Civil War looking like ultimately? What features could you predict with all your knowledge that you
Well,
have?
I think that Panarin has shared with us that it's an economic breakdown and a possible breakdown if there were any kind of biological or nuclear attack could be involved, civil unrest, political breakdown. So there's a sequence. They have in mind some kind of catastrophic sequence that our society's torn apart and then our ideological divide manifests. And in that manifesting, we go at each other. And that's what they're priming us for. That's what we're being primed for all the time. And I want to warn Americans, do not accept this priming.
Well, I couldn't agree with you more. I think it's a very dangerous potential path we're headed. Definitely, we see the situation, as you mentioned, Stephen Bannon, who even said that, and other strategists within the Trump administration called for playing Russia against China, Tucker Carlson blaming our policy towards Russia, driving it in the arms of China, and even the Russian officials, propaganda officials, and foreign ministry people, saying that Fox News and Tucker Carlson are quote objective news sources. It reminds me what the Soviets used to say about American left and liberal media publications and outlets. Saying
Yeah,
they're
it's
effective,
to put it
progressive.
frankly, it's childish to talk like that. It's not strategic thought. It's childish wishful thinking. But with that, Nevin, I have to go. So I want to thank you for having me on here.
Oh, sure, anytime. And we're going to have you, I'm sure, many times this year and hopefully following years. And you stay well, happy and a healthy new year. God bless everybody. And let's hope and pray for a better America. Take care.
Yep. Thank you.
Okay.